Good afternoon. I'm John Mair, speaking to you from sunny downtown Jericho in Oxford. Welcome to the second My Virtual Jericho. Last week was with Yvonne Constance from the County Council. Next week will be a professor talking about Iris Murdoch. But this week is a very sort of special edition. Two people who've done real My Jerichos in their time. Will Wyatt, who was Manager Director of Television at the BBC and Deputy DG, a boy who grew up around the corner in Kingston Road and went to school locally at what was then Phil and Jim's, and mysteriously got through the 11 plus and went to Magdalen College School. We'll draw a veil over that one, shall we, Will? And Peter BENNETT-JONES, who's one of the great powerhouses of British television, who lives just up the Woodstock Road. He is Lenny Henry's agent. He's been responsible for Vic of Dibley, for Comic Relief, for Sport Relief. He's the agent to all the stars, and still he lives in Oxford. What we're going to talk about first is going to let them have 2 minutes on, is the BBC in peril and should it be? Let's first of all go to Will Wyatt. Will, should the BBC be in peril?
Well, I don't think it should be, but I think it is. It's odd in a way that we're discussing this now with the nation in lockdown and the world in crisis, really, about the virus. And it's clear that at the moment, the BBC is playing a blinder, I would say, in terms of the number of people watching and listening and trusting it for its information. And it's playing a huge national role in that. And indeed, again, it's quite odd that we're discussing it now, and that the nation is also, we're meant to be leaving the EU properly at the end of this year, but one way or another, if it's not then, it'll be very soon after Brexit. And Britain as a country is known around the world for the freedom of its information and the quality of its journalism, as well as, for that matter, its creative entertainment. And the BBC has been the backbone of that. Well, not by no means the only thing, but very, very important. And indeed, it's known around the world and trusted around the world for the quality and accuracy of its reporting, as indeed it is in this country. I mean, Ofcom did a review last year and say, well, the BBC is the nation's chief source of info. So it's odd in a way that we're questioning this now, but it is in peril, I think, for two reasons. There is a change of leadership at the top, which kind of lights a spark with the Director General standing down this year. But of course, there's a government with an ideological edge, which has made it absolutely clear that it's got a kind of something must be done about the BBC view. That is ideological. It's clear that Dominic Cummings, one of the backbones of the advisors of the government, very important, has long believed the BBC was a propagandist organisation, and this is dangerous. I don't believe that is true. And the reason it's even more dangerous, all this at the moment, is that there's a seismic shift in the way that entertainment, information, and communications of all kinds are being delivered with the whole streaming revolution of the past 10 years. So that makes something pretty threatening to any traditional broadcasting organization. So it is. I don't think it should be, as I've hinted already. I think the quality of what it provides for the UK, 90% of the country use it every week. It's a huge source of British creative content and British talent. Peter knows better than most how important it's been to them. And that's not to say that this is not an argument for the status quo. Things will have to change in time. At the moment, it's funded by a license fee until 2027. There's talk of making the license fee voluntary rather than legally binding. That, I think, would lead to a huge loss of revenue. And it's clear to me that in some parts of the government or in some places, there's a death by 1,000 cuts view of the BBC, which I think would be a disaster.
Let me ask you a couple of quick questions. You say the BBC's had a good coronavirus war. Some people see it as the Boris Broadcasting Corporation. They've not been critical enough.
Well, I've read there are arguments about whether the herd immunity was a way that we should have gone, and there are now those, one hears them from various people about the lockdown and whether it's too draconian. I think the first, I've seen all these views represented on, or heard them represented on the BBC. But it's also very important that I think that if there is a crisis in which lives are threatened, it is the BBC's role to proclaim that clearly, and also to question where necessary. I don't recognise what you're saying, but you're never going to have a world in which the broadcasters are thought to be doing a wonderful job by everyone.
Have you watched Sky News at all during the corona crisis? They've actually been
I have.
much better public information than the BBC has in lots of ways. Every bulletin has, what to do, this is what to do. Do you not agree with that?
Well, I've been getting that all the time. It seems to me, and particularly on the website, it's all over it, and there's no way of avoiding it. Thank goodness, because we all need reminding. I'm not saying Sky do a good job, 3 cheers, and so do ITN actually in Channel 4 News. But to say that others are doing a good job too doesn't mean to say the BBC is not.
Okay, let's switch, if we can, to Peter Bennett-Jones. Peter, you're a major supplier. Is the BBC in peril? Should it be in peril?
Well, let me say, I echo a lot of what Will says. I mean, I've always been outside the BBC looking in and supplying in either programs or artists. And I regard myself as a huge admirer and advocate, but a critical friend in some respects. Because I think it is a uniquely important institution in the nation's fabric, sort of glue, and some of that's being shown now in this current crisis. And in a way, we can list a litany of its attributes which are so important, and it's blooming good value as well. I mean, it's £3 a week. It's about a quarter of the price of the minimum Sky package or any of these subscription services. And you can still get a £1 a week black and white license, I notice, for, if you really want to see it, but you can't afford. But and it's got the quality of output across all radio, TV, online is phenomenal, I think. And, in my comic relief capacity, I've witnessed the whole corporation working at full throttle, with all its regional, national, different media all putting in the same direction to the common good. And it's a very impressive machine when it's in full operation. But having said all that, there is no doubt that it is in peril on 2 fronts, on the political front and the commercial front. And I think when the corona crisis has dissipated, it'll be politics as normal. Maybe the BBC will have improved its defensive position a bit, but I agree. I think there are lots of other good news outlets, but the BBC, if they play the game right, can capitalise on its coverage and trustworthy. It's adapted quite well to operating, from with different technology. People broadcasting from home. I look after some of the Today presenters, and they, Martha and people. They're amazing. You wouldn't even know they were in their front room. I think it's been extraordinary, and the editorial standards maintained. But, I think, rest assured that, especially with Cummins, if he stays where he is, with a very ideologically driven cabinet under a very sort of, the leader that we have, I think there'll be saber rattling will resume. And it's incumbent on the BBC to be ahead of the game on that in some way, and be offering solutions. Because even with a 2027 renewal, which is, we're only 3 years into the current charter, there is a midway sort of health checkpoint, which they can inflict some damage. And I think there are severe ideological problems that our leaders have with it. They're not necessarily logical, but I think they're virtually tangible. And I think the commercial challenge, which brings peril to the organisation, forces that it's going to be very difficult to compete with. So that's part of the solution to saying, how do we work alongside the new technologies? Because everybody keeps comparing the BBC to Netflix, and it's ridiculous. It's no comparison. Netflix is just an entertainment outfit, but they are extremely they're not well funded. They're well indebted, but they spend a lot of money on their output. And, you know, I'd argue unless the BBC finds a way of negotiating with the powers that be, the governments and the regulators, because it is in the end a state broadcaster with a couple of Chinese walls, it has to find a way of doing less and having less expected of it and being allowed to reform and having significant savings or not having to compete in all markets. Because there will not be enough, you know, you should be able to run a state broadcaster on, well, it's 5 billion really, with 3.8 of it guaranteed. You should be able to run a state broadcaster or a public service broadcaster on considerably less than that if one is allowed to do less. But it has unique properties, say, and culturally, cross training, you know, it's almost alone now in training and providing opportunities for creative talent. And as you know, I argue in the book that the organisation would be best served by splitting itself in two in a way. I think it's like schizophrenic, and have a news and current affairs side and an entertainment and drama side, and protect some of the areas of market failure. But that's the longer argument.
What would you do with the license fee then, Peter? What would you do with the license fee? Would that be only for news and current affairs, and entertainment would be behind a paywall?
Well, that's one solution. I think you can look at different models. You know, I think that there are technical problems with the abolition of the license fee, which might well help protect the license fee because of the way Freeview is set up. So I don't necessarily think the license fee will go, but I'm sure what it's spent on will change. You know, and I don't think there's one easy to tick solution at the moment. I think different models have to be tested and looked at.
Is the BBC your first port of call for programmes and for your clients these days still? Well,
it's a very important port of call. I mean, it's a very frustrating institution to supply to because they're oversupplied, and as with the supermarkets or anywhere else, you know, when in an oversupplied market, the buyer can behave as it thinks fit, really. And, you know, I think there are huge room for improvement in how it procures and commissions. But actually what lands up on screen is consistently pretty good, but there are a lot of corpses on the way in the supplier market. But to be fair, the BBC have responded much more sympathetically to this current crisis, which is a crisis for creative artists, production companies, freelance suppliers, more sympathetically than any of the other broadcasters, as far as I can see. There's some noises about helping freelancers at Channel 4, but my experience with the other broadcasters is you're out on your own, mates.
Will, just back to you. Decriminalising the licence fee, the consultation that ended today, I believe, and there was a BBC document yesterday, wasn't there? What's that going to cost the BBC?
Well, the BBC's they've analysed it, and they think it'll cost them 300 million a year going over the next few years. Frankly, I think I'd be surprised if it was as little as that, because I think I fear once it comes to renewal time, I mean, people don't have to renew. I think you'll be chasing an awful lot of folk. The trouble with it, of course, is at the moment, not many people think lots of people go to jail over this. They don't. A few, very few people, 5, and that's for not paying, obeying the court, not for not paying the fee, as it were. But if you make it a civil debt for people, everyone will have to pay the same if they're chased for it. I mean, it would cost the BBC a fortune in lawyers to chase them, and then they'd go to court, and then those who were found they should have paid it will, I fear, have to pay a lot more than they would have done currently. I don't think it's the right solution. I do think if you're looking ahead to 2027, when the current license fee comes to an end, by then I would very much hope that the BBC has come forward with some inventive and clever plans about how it should be financed from there on, which would probably include, I think, some form of a license fee, but they may have to do other things as well thereafter. I don't have a plan myself. One can see all kinds of possible models of subscription here, voluntary payment there, license or other things. But as Peter says, as far how do you if it's the radio, there's no way you can stop people listening to the radio if they don't pay their license fee. And of course, with Freeview, and an awful lot of people get their television that way, there's no way you can stop them getting their television if they don't pay a license fee. So there are real problems.
Let's be realistic. The BBC says 300 million. Realistically, it's 500 million a year they will lose in revenue at least, won't they? What difference?
I think it'll be a lot more.
How much does the BBC will go if that happens?
Well, you'd certainly be taking a television channel off the F4 or 2, and you'd be hacking into radio. I don't know exactly. It would be a lot of, you'd have to think pretty carefully, but it would be pretty deep cuts. Remember that the BBC has in fact taken a 25% cut over the past decade in any case, given that the license fee has been flat and inflation has gone up by about 24%. So there would be dramatic cuts.
Now you're not quite 75, but when you are, you'll qualify for a free license. What do you think about that particular deal from the BBC?
I qualify for a free license. I think the solution that they've proposed is a reasonable one. I mean, the terrible thing was catching that particular spiky ball in the first place, because there's no way you can come out of this happily, and they'll have to take some hit, I think. But if they can, if the proposal that it is to people who are on benefits over the age of 75, then people get them free, that would seem to be fair enough. Not least because, as Peter said, it's £3 a week, 40p a day, and the older people use the BBC far more for obvious reasons. They don't go and travel around so much. They probably haven't got as much money, so they get probably best value out of it.
But if Boris and Dominic have their way, the BBC will pay the entire old people's license fee, which is £1 billion.
Indeed.
What difference will that make?
Well, I think the BBC have said, you'd be taking BBC Two off the air, and you'd be probably losing a radio channel network or two. You might have to start hacking into local radio or something. God knows what else. I mean, it would be dramatic.
Peter, if the BBC lost £1.5 billion, £2 billion a year, what difference would that make?
Well, it would also be, it would make fundamental differences. It would, it would have to do, less, not by choice in a way. I think both those issues of decriminalisation and the over 75s are, the trouble is they're political hot potatoes, aren't they? They're seen as vote winners, and the BBC has got to make public case. I agree absolutely with Will that there should be some sort of system where the means testing system they have for the over 75s to pay. It's a lot of people can easily afford to pay, and they're big users. So I think they have to make the case very strongly. And but the BBC will have to model itself on these radical drop in income if these two measures come into place. And so it can't just be piecemeal. It has to be whole services, and they have to have the agreement, presumably, of the regulators and government to do that. I mean, there are some certain things which you feel, I think the rolling news service is I don't know how much it costs, but is it a necessity when there's so much other news provision and a lot of
online? Would you chop online?
Daytime stuff?
World Service? Would you chop online? Would you chop the World Service?
Well, World Service is the funding and its ecology is so different. I think that just has to be treated on its own merits. I mean, I think it's suffered a terrible editorial decline in the last few years, but and it needs in many ways better leadership, but it still has a very important function to play, and I think has to be argued on its own merits. I think it needs to focus, John, on the areas of sort of potential market failure. Yeah. So where I see the BBC as particularly important is very important culturally, in the with whether it be music or writing or performing or acting, and the training focuses that. I think it's very important in children's television. It has a completely sort of unique offering, and it's brilliant. It's excellent. And it also engages the future viewing generation with a sort of diet that's highly superior to commercial competitors on the whole. I mean, obviously there's good stuff around everywhere, but it has an educational role that's vital. And I think if it focuses on the public service element and builds out from there and does less big drama, less, comedy is very important. Not many people do comedy apart from the BBC. Do what other people don't do and do what it does best.
Orchestras, what would you do with them? What would you do with the proms?
Well, I think that's of great cultural importance, and that there's a great, nobody else would or could do it to that level. And so I think that is, again, it has a unique offering, which has, pretty broad pickup as well with its television and radio applications. So I think it's exactly those unique events, and I think it can almost get out of sport. Because it's too competitive. They have to pay too much money for sports rights. Why do you need Formula One on the radio on a Sunday morning? You just don't need it.
Now, I wrote a chapter in the book where I tried to get inside the mind of Dominic Cummings and said what the BBC would be like when he's Deputy Prime Minister. Was that way off the mark? What would be cut?
Well, it shouldn't be up to Dominic Cummings. I don't know how much television he watches. I shouldn't think very much, John. He'll watch Newsnight and Panorama and the news, and I imagine. So in a way, I think the BBC has to get on the front foot, not get into Dominic Cummings' mind, but get into their own way of thinking of what they do uniquely and brilliantly and make the case for it.
Will, back to you. If you were still a very senior executive in the BBC, what would you be selling now to the British public to retain the licence fee and to stop the huge cuts?
Well, I'd emphasise that
I think he's frozen.
this is something that is available to everyone all the time, wherever they are and however well off or not they are. And that there are an awful lot of things where we sort of come together, and unless you're there regularly doing this, it's no good hoping people will pop in for the annual service of remembrance of Poppy or the D-Day anniversary, or indeed a comedy that comes from Peter's clients, if they don't have a habit of doing it, and it's not available there for everyone. And I think that is the underlying principle. Now that's what's been the licence fee has not only made that possible, it's kind of demanded that you've got to think all the time about this is what do people require in that to have the chance of listening to or knowing about, seeing or enjoying, if this is the only service they've got and it's free to air. Now all these other wonderful stuff all over the place now, as I've said, I think the whole streaming revolution and all that, where was binge viewing 10 years ago? No, there was no such phrase. No one ever thought about it. It does change things hugely, and I think it will change them more, obviously, in time to come. But I would say, don't chuck out the baby with the bathwater when you've got something where, it's clear that whatever you think about the quality of one newspaper or another, when shit hits the fan, as it were, nationally, or indeed we want to come together and celebrate the great stories and glories of the British people, the BBC is the place that it has happened till now. So let's work out how that continues before we start knocking it.
Okay, but back to Peter. Peter, if you were to be hired by the BBC now to sell them to the great British public, what would you sell? Well,
just the consistent range and quality of what it does, I think, and its trustworthiness. I mean, I sometimes think the whole news department has an arrogance and a misplaced belief in its own impartiality. But having said that,
you got turned over, didn't you? You got mildly turned over by them.
Well, I've been on the receiving end of aggressive tactics, and and I'm sure a lot of people have, which is just like being attacked by a tabloid newspaper. In the end, it's the values seem to be pretty similar. But having said that, and I think this has been shown, and I think ITN and Sky are pretty damn good at what they do as well. And I think across the board, the standard of presenting and reporting is absolutely superb. I mean, be it Laura Koonsberg or anybody we're seeing on our screens, they are really good at what they do. So I think that you have to just remind people and point out what life would be like if these things weren't part of our life. I used to love that Dunlop advert that you'd be going along and it showed what would happen if you didn't have a Dunlop product. So somebody would be serving at Wimbledon and the ball would disappear. You know, be going along on an escalator and the escalator would do a walkway and the walkway would disappear. I think not having the BBC in our lives and having a clever way of portraying that to all ages, be it CBBS all the way up to the Antique Roadshow, it's part of the fabric of our lives, and we probably take it for granted too much. And the BBC's best weapon is the public's respect, even though, you know, you're going to have little glitches of irritation, but we should not be governed by a small caucus of admittedly very powerful politicians who don't share that view.
Has the BBC overreached in certain areas? The papers all say that BBC Online should be abolished because that's what they do.
Well, that's part of the commercial pressures, isn't it? You know, they don't want a subsidised body next door to them, but, you know, BBC, some of the BBC education offerings are, you know, very important to the national fabric, and they're free and they need to be free ideally. Whereas, you know, there are market considerations to be had there, but they are respected. And again, if you're, I mean, it's difficult to get public support when you've got large part of your competitors are your commentators, as is the case with most of the newspaper industry, obviously. But there are clever ways of making the case, and that's where I think a lot of thinking has to be done, just to keep the love of the consumers, because in the end, a government won't want to destroy something that's valued by the bulk of the population.
Will, about 15 years ago, you were forced by the Monopolies Commission to Radio Times couldn't be the only one having bill-ins, and also BBC publications and so on. You know, the BBC was reined in commercially. Was that painful for you? Could you hear me? Can you hear me, Will?
I missed that. So could you just
I would say
repeat the question?
about 15 years ago, you were reined in by the Monopolies Commission, and the listings went to everybody, and also things like publications and so on became cut adrift from the BBC. I think you were in charge, and was that painful for you to do?
Not 15 years ago, I think 25 years ago,
Okay.
and I've been out of the place 20 years. So no, I think it seemed a problem. Actually, I know the BBC fought against it, obviously, but it kind of made sense for the communications industry as a whole. And remember now that there's an organisation, Ofcom, which takes a view about all these things and is indeed there to oversee what the BBC is allowed to expand or not expand into or contract into. That, just on the political point, I think that Peter was making, it's worth remembering that a few years ago, the BBC planned to cut the little listened to Radio 1X, Radio 6s or whatever, the sort of specialist pop channel. And there were questions in the House, a bloody great round, the BBC had to back off. Now that was a station no one listened to, or hardly anyone listened to at the time. Think about trying to do that with a major TV channel or a radio network. So it won't be that easy.
No, but Will, it has to be done by sort of cooperative negotiation, because otherwise, you know, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. You try and make a cut, and that was a good example, and then basically has to cave in to quite small pressure, although, you know, I have very fine clients working on 6, but you know, I think it has to be done by negotiation, saying if you want us to exist on, say, 2.5 billion income, if that's the implications of all these cuts, or 3 billion, and we can make a bit more on commercial exploitation of superstar shows like, you know, Strictly. Imagine life without Strictly. You know, that's something that people should think about. And you know, and I think it has to be done in a non-confrontational way, having established what it is that is as I say, unique and important. And public service broadcaster, you know, public service should be the watchwords here. And I think a bit they are chasing a bit too much commercially and don't need to compete. They don't need to compete a lot with with the Netflixes of this world. You know, it's a different game.
Was it wise to take BBC Three onto the internet?
Oh, it was essential. Essential.
Why is that, Will?
I mean, the internet is not something separate. It's part of a communications continuum for any organization. And without doing it, you'd be confining yourself to what will fall away quite possibly. So I think that was essential. And, you know, and I think it's been pretty well done on the whole. So I wouldn't go back on that.
But young people don't seem to be able to find BBC Three on the internet. They find lots of other things. They find
they're not as clever as they ought to be.
Don't blame the audience, Will. Don't blame the audience.
They can find it. I mean, you know, there's a lot of choice out there, and when you get something that you know, takes, and Fleabag is the most obvious example, which was I think a BBC Three origination. You know, it can go global. So it's difficult to, you know, produce hit after hit on a, you know, regular basis, but they do what they do pretty well, and I think, you know, they engage a lot of young people. I mean, it seems to be the holy grail. That I think that's too much emphasis sometimes is put on chasing those younger audiences, because people, you know, grow into it like theatre. I've been sat on a lot of theatre boards in my time. There's always a big agenda about how do we get young people in, and you know, that's perfectly valid, and you can do ticketing arrangements and school party arrangements to allow for that. But ultimately, people tend to go to theatre when they've, you know, got a bit more money and a bit more time on their hands, and not got children to do the homework with. It's just the way it is, and there's nothing wrong with that.
So are they wasting their time chasing the Holy Grail, chasing the YouTube audience?
No, I don't think they're wasting their time at all. I think you've got to do things that have broad and universal appeal, but you don't need to change the format or the presenter of something that works brilliantly because you think, you know, oh, we better put somebody young on Desert Island Discs because that'll appeal to young people. That's too simplistic. You know, I mean, very nice hearing Daniel Radcliffe, but in the end, I'd much rather hear somebody who has got a whole lifetime career behind them, and somebody who didn't really know their work in a way. And I feel that's just an example, really. And he's brilliant at what he does. I'm not criticizing Daniel Radcliffe at all. That the you know, they're sort of chasing something in a way that's a bit crude sometimes, and they've got a lot on offer to all audiences and all ages, and you don't need to prioritize one over the other.
Well, a tricky question. Come June, the BBC won't have a Tony Hall as Director General. Who will it have, and what would you look for in the next DG? Can we hear it?
Guts.
Guts.
I think clearly a strong belief in the idea of public service broadcasting, and that having something there for everyone and supporting that, and believing in the ethic and indeed the, as it were, the vision of the BBC is crucial. But guts is the other one, and also I think political nous and broad shoulders, or broad able to put up with the pressure. It does need someone who's big enough to be in the same room as the Prime Minister or whomever and say, this is a resigning matter, Prime Minister, I will go and I'll take, or whatever. It's got to be someone who really feels comfortable.
But didn't Mark Thompson do that when on old age pension license fee?
Apply.
You keep talking. Peter, what qualities you'd like to see in the next DG?
Well, I mean, I can't. It doesn't seem to be much chat about it, but you know, I think it's a good opportunity to divide the job in two. I think it's too big a job for one person, because the responsibilities and skills required are just so diverse and immense that, you know, I think there's an argument of having an editor-in-chief, you know, responsible for output really, and a chief executive. I mean, a sort of model on a bigger scale that's worked at the Financial Times, say, or on a lot of newspapers. But I was watching how it's worked at the Financial Times for the last 15 years, where you've got a very, you know, high-profile editor in Barber, and then a fantastic chief executive behind him is a more realistic model. And I agree with Will. It needs somebody who's got absolute, guts, balls of steel, or whatever. It does need somebody with great political engagement skills, as well as, dealing with the culture of the organization. It's a big and complex organization, and it has to have leadership which can, build a culture that's going to be continue to be a place where people want to work, where the most talented, creative people want to work, and which produces incredible output. So it's a big job. I wouldn't wish it on anybody.
But you're outside the tent, aren't you? Who would you like to see as next Director General? Give some names.
Well, I would say I think editorially Charlotte Moore is very good if you're just looking for the editorial side of the job. I've seen Peter Bazalget's name toyed around with both, whether it's DG or chairman. He's perfectly capable of doing either job. I think he is a superb operator and has all the experience as an ex-BBC man, chairman of ITV, chairman of the Arts Council, and a major independent supplier, and an extremely good business person. So, it's somebody with those qualities, and whether he's in the frame or not. I think there's some very good people who seem to have been ruled out, particularly some very powerful and effective women. The Sharon White from Ofcom would have been a very good, interesting candidate, but she's just taken a big job somewhere else. As with Carolyn Fairburn at the CBI. I think these people with incredible experience and some outside perspective, would be very interesting candidates.
Now, in case you've just tuned in, by the way, that's Peter Bennett-Jones, who's an Uber agent. And let's go to Will Wyatt, who's former Managing Director of Television. Will, runners and riders for the next Director General, and should it be a woman?
Well, there's no reason why it should not be a woman or should be a woman. I mean, you want the best possible person. The names that Peter mentioned, I would also, which are very capable women. I think probably in an ideal world, it would be a pleasing coup to have a woman DG, but I don't think that is in any way the most important thing. That would be icing on the cake. There are 2 women there he mentioned, and some men, and there are others who one think might be able to step up and do this job. Although, as Peter said, the skill set is huge. It is there has been, of course, in the past when Mike Checklin was Director General, a long time ago now. He was from a financial background and organized, as it were, a sort of chief operating officer sort of background. And he had a sort of top journo alongside him to help with the editorial shaping.
Who got rid of him in the end?
That again, I could see that working.
Yeah. So, but who would you like to see in that job?
Sorry, I couldn't get that.
On the board for it.
Who would I like to see?
Who would you like to be the next DG?
Well, I'd need to see one or two more of these people close up and ask them some questions, I think. And there may even be people we haven't thought of. There's at least, you haven't mentioned Tim Davie, who runs BBC Studios. Is a very, for a time when there was that all before. He's a class act.
You're breaking up a bit, so we'll go to Tim Davie as next DG. Any views on that?
Well, I'd still favour somebody from the outside coming in, and Tim has done a perfectly good job at BBC Worldwide, but I think it is not a demanding job. So I would say perhaps, but would need to be convinced that he had that full skill set to, both politically and creatively. Because basically BBC Worldwide is a commercial operation. It gets supplied, with its goods on a pretty easy basis, and it's got a huge workforce out there to sell its wares. And I think it's a 10th of the job or a 20th of the job of doing the DG job. And so it was interesting. I thought when Mark took over the very fact that he'd run Channel 4 for a while, as well as having very senior jobs at the BBC, stood him in good stead, particularly that spell at Channel 4, you know, because he's there running a broadcaster. But I remember talking to
not for very long.
Gavin Davis at the time saying, you know, Mark was ambivalent about whether to put his hat in the ring. And he said, we've just got to remember, it will be 10 times the job it is at Channel 4. You know, there is so much more involved. And, you know, you only have to see how many of the DGs in the last 40 years haven't lasted the course to realize how difficult a job it is, because they're all extremely able individuals.
Now, one name has been mentioned is George Osborne. What would you feel about that?
Well, I don't think you should have a politician doing this job.
Well,
especially a failed politician.
James Pennell. Will, if you could hear us and speak to us, George Osborne as DG, what do you think about that?
I think you're, well, capable bloke, but I think the idea of having a card-carrying politician as Director General would be extremely concerning. I wouldn't want it. You would colour all the complaints you get in any case about favouring one side or another, and of course everybody looks at these things through the prism of their own beliefs. Would be brought home, and you'd find it very difficult to make people feel that the organisation was not entrenched on one political side or another. Well, one political side.
Do you think that's true as well of James Pennell? He could
yes.
be.
Less so, because he's, as it were, the curse has been taken off him for a bit, and but I think the same.
And Peter Bennett-Jones, do you know James Pennell? Would he make a good DG?
Well, I think he's got a lot of the skills, actually. I think he's a highly effective operator. I think it is still, you know, it would be on the debit side that he's a, you know, card-carrying partisan politician. You know, it would make him more difficult to do the job than somebody who's perceived to be broadly apolitically or privately political. But I think he's an extremely able person, and as the internal candidates, you know, I'd say alongside Charlotte Moore with her editorial skills, they're the people with the best credentials, I would say.
Now, your near neighbour, Mark Thompson, was DG for 7 years. Was he a good DG, and why?
Well, I think he had the qualities. You know, he had the intellect, and he had the confidence, and he had the experience of running Channel 4 alongside huge BBC things. I think he probably got out at about the right time. I think there were some toxic issues there, but he's, you know, demonstrated subsequently by chief executive of the New York Times just quite how capable he is. I think the BBC were very lucky to have him, and I think he, you know, it was all, if you remember, the move to Salford and all the financing and politics around that, which he handled pretty adeptly. The big funding issues when he took the government on and tended to he was always taken seriously. So I think he was excellent, and the output remained very strong. I think there were some internal employment things which they made bad mistakes on, especially in the way they treated a lot of these tax issues on presenters. And I think the legacy of that has lived on and has made them seem to make people who know about it as extremely unpleasant employers when push comes to shove.
Will Wyatt, Mark Thompson a good DG, and what will the legacy of Tony Hall be? Will he be seen as a great DG?
Well, it always takes a bit of time before you can make those sorts of judgments, I think. I mean, Tony, he did a great job. I mean, he came in when the place was rocking on its heels. You know, there were senior executives in tears in Broadcasting House because they felt the place was crumbling. That's true. And you know, he took a grip. He gave it a confidence again. In all the sort of cultural areas, he's been extremely strong. I think the output's been pretty damn good under him, actually. And you know, all the time there was a serious 100% top journalist at the helm. I mean, the one big, and I wasn't close to the taking of the decision, or of course, was the over 75. So that seemed like at the time the story was that it was all right, you know, financially we worked it out, but actually it wasn't, because it was an exponential increase that they couldn't control. And I think we've seen that come home to roost now. That was a mistake, I think. I don't know, you know, that it was easy to say it from here. Others have said, oh, well, that was a resigning matter. Well, lots of people are very good on deciding what's a resigning matter when it's not them that's got to do the resigning and wondering what's going to happen thereafter. But I think otherwise, he's done a pretty good job.
But Mark Thompson did threaten to resign over that, as did the chairman at the time. They both said, if that happens, we're off. Did you hear that, Will?
I think that was true. On the other hand, also once heard that you know, that whatever happened, sooner or later they were going to come back and get the buggers, and sooner or later they did.
Peter, you want to say something?
Well, John, yeah, I mean, it was part of some horse trading, wasn't it? Now, it might be in retrospect that the trade didn't work for the BBC as well as it might have done, but he was getting the license fee fixed for a certain period, if I remember rightly, for a number of years, which allowed the planning that is required for any business. And a business, remember, without a balance sheet, effectively, it is extremely difficult organisation to run in that respect, because the investment that can be made when you can go out into to your shareholders or rely on your balance sheet, which nearly all other competitors can do, is not open to the BBC, and it is so closely regulated, which I think is, again, I mean, regulations are obviously required, but the caliber of, you know, it's been good, pretty good, much better than in other sectors, particularly the charitable sector, which I'm very familiar with and have, you know, a lot to say about the quality of regulation there. But I think the BBC, again, have to negotiate a position whereby they are allowed to manage their business effectively.
So let the BBC loose, is what you're saying. Take some of the guy ropes away. Let them be commercial.
Yeah, it can't be all things to all people all the time with a declining funding base and more competition on the outside. They've got to be allowed to say, we're not able to do this anymore, and that's got to be accepted, and then sell that to their audiences as a smaller thing. It's one way of negotiating these tricky waters ahead of them.
Now you've got a rainbow behind you. Think forward to 5 years' time. You know, to the end of the license round. What's the BBC going to be like in 2027?
Well, I suspect more radically different than it has been for some while. I think, you know, John Burt was a big reforming DG, although the reforms tended to be internal and, you know, dividing up commissioning and production and accommodating the growth of the independent sector. And I think it's going to be 5 years of containment, really. And the success, the new DG will be judged on the success of how on the front foot with the new chair, who's bound to be a political appointee. So he's got to have somebody who can deal with somebody who's sympathetic to the government agenda on this, because that's almost a given, I would say. And preserving the unique qualities of this wonderful national asset. And it won't be an easy task. I mean, I wish whoever takes this job on, you know, good fortune, because I think it'll be extremely tough. And I think the political forces, once we go back to some form of normality, although the BBC will have won more friends during this period, we hope, they'll still have a big fight on their hands.
Well, the BBC in 5 years' time, what will it be like?
Is that asking Will?
Well, that's Will Wyatt.
Yeah. Well, I agree in large part with what Peter said. I think the crucial thing for the incoming person, whoever he or she may be, is to maintain, as I say, that the sense of the purposes of the BBC, but also to come up with a plan about how it can go on past 2027, not relying entirely on a license fee, with more commercial partnerships, whatever. There may well have to be reductions in output, whatever, but the job is to produce that strategy and a plan that can deliver it. And I absolutely agree with Peter, get on the front foot. Don't wait for the government to come and tell you what you're allowed to do, but to say, what are the purposes of the BBC? How can we take those forward to a new world, or a world of individuality and choice and selection that there is now? How do we make that work in a new world? And how do we finance that without, as it were, becoming a completely commercial organization, and keep what we do in front of the entire British people?
So we have taken questions from the audience, and somebody in the audience did ask me to ask you how you justify your large pension. I haven't stunned you into silence.
How I justify my pension?
Yes.
Well, I started paying into the BBC. I started paying into the BBC pension fund in 1967. I paid into it until the year 2000. I bought every extra year I was able to buy out of out of my salary, and in order to and it was a good pension scheme. It was a pension scheme of its time. I'm afraid it's changed now, but there we are. I justify it because I did nothing untoward other than take advantage of what was there in a way that I thought would help my family most. Okay,
now one last thought from the two of you on the future and whether the BBC is in peril and what it can do. Perhaps Peter, you'd like to go first. Peter Bennett-Jones.
Well, in danger of repeating myself really, John, I think, I'm under a rainbow. Is there gold at the end of that rainbow for the BBC? No. There's going to be a smaller pot of gold. That's the River Tay, by the way. I feel, again, this new leadership, first the appointment of a new DG and then the appointment of a new chair, is going to be of fundamental importance in how it navigates itself over the next period. And so, I think getting those decisions right and the process of really examining, because it sadly went wrong last time. I agree. I think, Tony Hall's done a very respectable job indeed, and it was a very noble of him to take the job on, actually. I think it was, indeed. And I think he has been, it sounds a bit of a cliche, and a very safe pair of hands, which I think he has been. And I agree that the standard of the output, and we ultimately have to judge the BBC about what's on its screens and on its airwaves and on its online offerings. And that's been, and again, the cultural importance, which is very important to me, and again, is an area of particular importance and excellence to the BBC. So I think he's done great. It went wrong with a very bad succession, with a very able man who was unprepared and hit a crisis. And that can happen to anybody. It's happening to Boris Johnson at the moment. You become Prime Minister and you're dealing with a huge multifaceted problem, and that is a big test for anybody. And so getting those decisions right, and then those people combining with a good board and good executive behind them to implement reforms, some of them quite radical, on the front foot, being one step ahead of their ideological opponents, is going to be there, and bringing the public on side is going to be the best way of protecting something which is one of our great national assets. I can't stress too much how diminished our lives would be with a very diminished BBC.
Well, a last thought from you, please. Will Wyatt.
Well, I just add on to the end of what Peter said there. He said, take its viewers and listeners with it. I think it really got to try and round up all those people out in the UK who do relish the BBC and feel about it as Peter does. There is, I think, sooner or later, it needs an army of supporters. It really does, who come out and, they're not people who've got to say it's perfect, because no one should or could say that, but people who say exactly what Peter has said there. It needs a if not a crusade, then at least a kind of large battalion of folk who will support it, put their heads above the parapet and say, hang on a minute, when it's needed.
Okay, thank you both.
John, just to chip in an analogy there, I think
We're
where
going to a mountain now.
now I've got a picture of Everest because that's the mountain they've got to climb. And what I think, just the support the NHS is getting during this crisis, and I come from a medical family with, doctors riddled throughout my family, and it's sort of built into the fabric of many people's lives and the nation's lives. And the NHS is doing such a visibly fantastic job in this crisis. And I think, the BBC will have a lot to learn about how that support is going to turn into political support and based on national support of movement. So I think that's a very interesting time for the country, for these very important national institutions that have been in threat of getting barbarized. If that's
So cutting them back doesn't work, is what you seem to be saying.
I think you have to be selective. I mean, the NHS has a whole different set of challenges and needs and requirements. It's not a direct comparison in business terms, but it is in emotional terms. Okay.
Right, thank you both. Just to say, the book we've all been referring to is called "Is the BBC in Peril?" It's available on Amazon. I'm the lead editor on it. Only £5. Do buy it. Next week, Professor Gary Browning will be talking about Iris Murdoch, the well-known author and other things in North Oxford. And the week after that, we're going to have a virtual town hall in Jericho. Councils have been invited to turn up on their laptops, and you're going to be able to ask some questions. But meanwhile, thank you, Peter, and thank you very much, Will. And see you both in local pubs. Cheers.
When it's open.
Tell me where. Yes, if only.
Only. See you there.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much indeed.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.